Well, today is Dr. King weekend, and we're going to talk about racial justice today, as we do most Sundays in some way, shape, or form. And one of the things that's been on my mind the past few months, but especially this week, is the call in the racial justice movement right now to talk about ourselves as co conspirators together rather than, especially rather than as allies. We used to use the language allies most often, but people are saying it's time to talk about ourselves, that what we need from one another is to be co conspirators. And author Bettina Love, when she was asked, sort of, how do you define a co conspirator versus an ally? What she's she did in this in an interview that I was watching recently was talk about Bree Newsome and James Tyson. So some of you might remember Bree Newsome was the young black woman who climbed a flagpole outside of the South Carolina State House in June of 2015 after the bombing of not bombing after the shooting in the congregation in Charleston. She climbed the flagpole and took down the Confederate flag that was flying outside the state house. Do you guys remember Bree Newsome? Do you remember her? So she tells, author Bettina Love tells this story about Bree Newsome and James Tyson, who is a white man who joined her in that action. And what she says is that as the police were trying to figure out how to get Bree down from the flagpole, how to get her down before she took down the Confederate flag, they were saying, we know what we'll do. We will just tase the flagpole, metal flagpole, which obviously would have electrified her and caused her a grave injury or maybe death. And James Tyson, who is this white activist who was there with her, not watching from the sidelines, but was there right next to the flagpole, took his hand and put it on the flagpole because he knew that the police were far less likely to tase the flagpole if it meant tasing the white man standing next to it rather than just the black woman at the top. And Bettina Love says that that is what it means to be a co-conspirator rather than an ally. It means showing up, putting, not just being watching from a distance, not just agreeing that it's a good idea, but actually standing there right with your fellow human being fighting for justice and putting yourself on the line, putting your hand on the flagpole, putting some of what is yours at risk or sacrificing some of what is yours for the larger fight for the human community, for freedom, for racial justice. Co-conspiracy is about what we do in action, not just in language, is what Alicia Garza, who's mostly known as one of the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, says. She talks about the very first step being just showing up in ways beyond the obligatory Facebook post when something horrible happens. She talks about showing up in ways that leverage whatever power and privilege we have to hold towards supporting the on the ground leadership. It means showing up in ways that demonstrate a commitment to the movement, even if that means risking one's social status or livelihood or sometimes even one's life. This is what it means to be a co-conspirator, not just to agree intellectually, but to show up, bring our full selves, our full bodies into the fight with one another. But the word conspire actually comes from the Latin roots con, which means together or with, and spirare, which means to breathe. Spirare is also the root for the word spirit, to breathe. So to breathe together, that's what conspire means, to breathe together, to breathe with one another. And I think that the call to be co-conspirators is not, it's mostly spoken about as a call for white people to join Black people and Indigenous people and other people of color. But I think it's a powerful call for all of us to breathe with one another. The whole fight needs to breathe together, to put ourselves on the line with one another, being aware of what we bring and what is ours to offer to the movement. If we were truly co-conspirators, that would mean that when someone else can't breathe, we also can't breathe. We are bound up with one another in what Dr. King called an inescapable network of mutuality. Thinking about being co-conspirators today in this Dr. King weekend, because every year when it comes to this time, and actually many times throughout the year, I think about what Dr. King would be saying if he was alive today and if he was still a leader in the racial justice movement today. And I think that he would be one of the people calling for us to be co-conspirators with each other, because that's basically what he was calling for in much of his time. So many of us know Dr. King as a leader of the nonviolent social change movement, racial justice movement. But he actually wasn't always a pacifist. And I want to tell a little bit of the story of how he kind of came to that place in his life. In his writings, when he talks about how he came to this commitment to nonviolent social action, he says, he talks about being in seminary. So Dr. King went to seminary just outside of Philadelphia. He lived near Philadelphia from 1948 to 1951. And he was really trying to figure out how his Christian faith could fuel a social justice movement. And he writes that during this period, he's talking about his sort of senior year at seminary in 1950, 1951, I had almost despaired of the power of love in solving social problems. The turn the other cheek philosophy and the love your enemies philosophy are only valid, I thought, when individuals are in conflict with other individuals. When racial groups and nations are in conflict, I thought a more realistic approach was necessary. He writes, then one Sunday afternoon, I traveled to Philadelphia to hear a sermon by Dr. Mordecai Johnson, president of Howard University. He was there to preach for the Fellowship House of Philadelphia. Dr. Johnson had just returned from a trip to India, and to my great interest, he spoke of the life and the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi. His message was so profound and electrifying that I left that meeting and I bought a half a dozen books on Gandhi's life and works. Like most people, I had heard about Gandhi, but I had never studied him seriously. Dr. King writes, as I read his works, I became deeply fascinated by his campaigns of nonviolent resistance, by the idea of satyagraha, which is sort of a truth force or a love force. I delved deeper into the philosophy of Gandhi, and my skepticism concerning the power of love gradually diminished. I came to see for the first time that the Christian doctrine of love, operating through the Gandhian method of nonviolence, was one of the most potent weapons available to oppressed people in their struggle for freedom. This was 1950, 1951, and what some people in this congregation know, but not everybody, and what is actually just becoming kind of confirmed publicly by scholars, is that that sermon by Dr. Mordecai Johnson took place in our sanctuary, in that sanctuary that you were just watching in the Total Praise video. That in the 40s and 50s, we had a relationship, a partnership with Fellowship House, which was a sort of small house where they had monthly worship services, community worship services devoted to interfaith and interracial understanding that took place in our sanctuary. And we would publicize it to our congregation as one of the things that we did as a congregation. It's powerful to think about a 21-year-old Dr. King sitting somewhere in those pews, those uncomfortable pews that so many of us know so well. I imagine that it's on the exact same cushions that we sit on Sunday mornings there when we're in together in person, because I'm not sure that those cushions have been changed in 70 years. And I think that, though I think about the history that those walls have seen and the power that can take place when we choose to be in relationship with one another, when we choose to breathe with one another, that you never know what kind of incredible spark is going to happen, what kind of incredible moment is going to happen for somebody who's there with you, who might go on to lead the whole country and the world in a revolution. I don't think we can take that much credit for Dr. King's leadership, but it is an incredible thing to be part of, even a small part of his story. What he writes about further is that even though that moment really sparked his delving deeply into the philosophy of Gandhi and becoming intellectually committed to Gandhi's methods, his embodied commitment, his full breathing with knowing throughout his whole being commitment didn't happen until he experienced doing nonviolent direct action with the Montgomery bus boycotts when he was serving as a pastor there in 1955 and 1956. So if you fast forward then to 1963 to the story that Hannah shared with us earlier about the Children's March and the demonstrations that were happening in Birmingham, Alabama at the time, his commitment to nonviolence had deepened significantly by then, even though he writes often about how he had to keep explaining it and the movement had to keep teaching people about it over and over again because so many people believed that nonviolent direct action was a passive thing, was a conciliatory thing, or sometimes even a cowardly thing. He writes, "We had to make it clear over and over again that nonviolent resistance is not a method of cowardice. It does resist. It's not a method of stagnant passivity or deadening complacency. The nonviolent resistor is just as opposed to evil that he is standing against as the violent resistor, but he resists without violence. This method is non-aggressive physically, but strongly aggressive spiritually." But over and over again, he had to explain this aggressive spiritual soul force, truth force, love force method of trying to create change in the world. And in 1963, in the middle of those marches, the children were some of the first people to be arrested in the 1963 marches. It all happened within just a couple of weeks at the beginning of April in Birmingham. But eventually, 2,000 or 3,000 people were arrested for taking part in those sit-ins and marches and boycotts, including Dr. King. And on April 12th, which was Good Friday, he was arrested and put into a Birmingham jail. And on that same day, what was called a call for unity was published in a local newspaper. It was an open letter written by 8 white clergy people in the area. I think it was maybe 7 Christian clergy people and clergymen and 1 rabbi, all of whom were white men, who described the demonstrations that had been happening as extremist acts led by outside agitators that, while technically peaceful, had served to incite hatred and violence. These clergymen agreed with the goal of ending segregation, they said. They believed that the Black community should go about it, however, through the proper channels, which they described as courts and peaceful negotiations with politicians. saying the route of demonstrations was unwise and untimely. This was an open letter published that in a newspaper that was then snuck into the jail to Dr. King. And in response, he wrote what we know of as the letter from the Birmingham jail. And I've preached about this letter, this part of Dr. King's sort of radical legacy a couple times before, but I'm curious how many of you have actually read the full letter from a Birmingham jail? It's really long. Okay, yeah, a handful of you have. It's like 7,000 words long. If you listen to it, an audio version of it, it takes like almost an hour to read. It's a very substantial letter. Thank you. Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, and it's worth reading the letter if you take some time, or just listening to it as you're doing something else this weekend. And it's worth reading the call to unity that the clergy people put in the mail beforehand. Because though I always want to believe that I would have been one of the people marching alongside Dr. King, I think most of us want to believe that. And some of us actually were. I know some people in this congregation were part of that movement. I want to believe that we as a congregation would have been considered co-conspirators by Dr. King. Reading the letter gives me pause because these were white clergy people. I'm a white clergy person. They were committed in theory, or at least intellectually, to the goal of ending segregation and racial justice, as I am. And the arguments that they make are so similar to so many arguments that have occasionally rattled around in my head, or that I hear from other UU clergy people and UU lay leaders, that I hear from other people of faith, other white people of faith that I work with in power and interfaith justice coalitions here in Philadelphia. Arguments like, maybe we should go a little bit more slowly. We should give the new administration time to take some action before we are so forcefully out in the streets. That we should go through the proper channels. That these peaceful demonstrations incite violence. When I read this letter from those clergy people, I ask myself again, which side am I on? And what would Dr. King say to me? I'm not positive that I would always have been on the right side of history. I'm not positive that Dr. King would always consider me a co-conspirator rather than one of the stumbling blocks to freedom. Because though Dr. King is revered almost universally in our culture now in the United States, in his own day he was considered very radical, especially by whites, including white liberals who intellectually believed in racial justice. And his views kept evolving and kept becoming more radical over time, to the point where he was critiquing capitalism out in the open, was critiquing the military-industrial complex. And his ultimate assassination came about not through a racial justice protest, but through an economic justice protest by aligning himself with poor people. In the letter from a Birmingham jail, Dr. King writes, "I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I've almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with you in your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes that he can set the timetable for another person's freedom." Dr. King wrote in this letter, "Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding of people from people of ill will. Which side are we on? Which side are we on? Do we show up as allies who agree intellectually, or do we show up as co-conspirators willing to put our hand on the pole, willing to put our lives and status on the line for one another? Breathing together feels like such an important metaphor for us today, especially in the racial justice movement. From police brutality that forces Black men's last words to be, "I can't breathe," again and again and again, to a pandemic that is devastating to each one of us, but disproportionately affects Black and Indigenous and Brown and other people of color in our country and around the world. To our being so isolated so that we can literally keep away from breathing on or with one another. It nevertheless feels so important to me that we not only commit to racial justice with our minds and with our voices and our votes right now, but that we put our bodies into it, that we put our power and our privilege and our status and any other resources that we have available to us on the line for one another. And so as we join together this morning, I'm going to invite us to breathe in together. Let's breathe in and back out. Breathe in and back out. Each one of us wants to believe that we would have been one of the good ones back then and that we are one of the good ones right now. The ones marching alongside and risking alongside. But back then and right now, this work requires a huge willingness to risk and to sacrifice what is ours in this lifetime, both for Blacks and other people of color and for whites. It's not something that we can do casually, and it's not something that just agreeing with the goal will give us. We should never take for granted that we're on the right side of history just because we voted a certain way or just because we condemn things like the Capitol riots that happened in these past couple of weeks. And though each one of us, I believe, here strives to be committed to the goal of racial justice, to be allies for racial justice, to understand it and speak articulately about it and use our voices in service of racial justice. It's important for us to ask again and again, are we co-conspirators, not just allies, in the movement to end racial oppression today? Are we people who show up and listen and risk alongside and sacrifice alongside and breathe with one another? And this movement is not just direct action in the streets. This is a movement that takes place in our schools and in our workplaces, in our congregations, in our families. Our work is about risking and sacrificing in all of these places, with all that we have, all that we bring to the table. So as you go forth into this weekend, I hope that you will spend some time asking these questions of yourself, because I think it's an important thing that I do regularly. I think it's important for all of us to regularly ask ourselves these questions. Which side am I on? What would Dr. King say to me? Would I have been there with him as a co-conspirator? Would I have been one of the people co-signing the letter that he had to while he was in jail. With whom do you breathe? And when the call comes and your fellow is in danger, will you put your hand on the pole? Will you put yourself on the line? May each one of us breathe together, give of ourselves together, that this movement may continue to blossom and reach someday soon the goals that Dr. King spoke about so long ago. Amen, and blessed be.
Hi, I'm Reverend Hannah Capaldi.
And I'm Reverend Abbey Tennis. We are the ministers at the First Unitarian Church of Philadelphia, where our mission is to awaken love and justice in our lives and in the world.
We're so grateful that you watched, and we hope that the sermon connected with your soul.
We also want to invite you to join us for a live worship service every Sunday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. You can always find the link to that service on our website at www.philauu.org. In these services, you'll hear words like you've just heard, and you also get a chance to greet one another, pray together, sing together, and we even hold a virtual coffee hour after services to get a chance to greet some new and old friends.
If you want to support the mission of this community and you feel moved to give, you can do so by going to the website that Reverend Abbey just mentioned. You can find that link below, or you can text 215-709-5095 and follow the prompts to give.
If someone in your life needs to hear these words today, we encourage you to share this video. And again, thank you so much for watching.
We hope to see you soon.